A very, very sad day for wrestling. For those who don't know, for those who do, Jim Crockett Jr. passed away yesterday at the age of 76 due to organ failure. And it's a very sad day for many wrestling fans, but especially for his family and his close friends. And my heart, and thoughts go out to them during this tough time. But he was such an influence on why I'm a wrestling fan to this day. And I wasn't even, old enough to appreciate Mid Atlantic Championship Wrestling, Jim Crockett Promotions at the time. I had to get tapes from a buddy that, had old tapes, and I had to watch, the syndicated programs and stuff like that, and all the stuff that, Jim Crockett Jr. was able to do with his father's business. His father passed away, I believe, in 1973, and ran that business really well. It made good, steady money. They were doing some great business when it was just Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling in Carolinas, Virginias, and stuff like that. They were always, full of talent, and even when, there were dips and everything. I'm sorry, I'm trying not to get emotional here, but even when there were dips, you always appreciated what Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling was. And then when Jim Crockett Jr. took it over, along with his family and along with the right people as far as bookers and talents, it changed. I mean, he brought George Scott in. It went from a tag team territory to a singles-based territory. But tag team wrestling was always featured properly in Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, and then later Jim Crockett Promotions. And when you think NWA territories, yes, there are so many NWA territories from the time it formed. Having a touring world champion. I mean, so many great NWA world champions. But when territories disbanded from the NWA and started to, do their own thing and stuff like that, and even into the 80s, world class and stuff like that, Jim Crockett Promotions rose to new heights. When you think about it, he is the pioneer when it comes to like big events. Yes, there were baseball stadium events or football stadium events and stuff like that in Dallas, World Class Championship Wrestling, and even Vern Gagne and the AWA ran some big events and stuff like that. And there were always these occasional big events. But then you think about where Jim Crockett Promotions was under, his father's reign, and he ran it well. But then you see that things started to grow and grow because there was an outcry for real wrestling, real characters, like, people that weren't actually playing characters, that were just real people. Even if they were playing characters, even if it was just themselves, with the volume turned way up. And, the amount of talent that came through, I wouldn't be able to encapsulate in one video the amount of talent that came through the Carolinas, and then later Jim Crockett Promotions with the expansion. He just knew how to utilize talent. He knew how to present it well. He knew how to get the right people with him. And, he was such an influence that even when things fell, kind of on their ass due to going in the hole on money that was, and I'm not going to get really too deep into that, though. There have been various shoot interviews and Cornette's podcasts have talked about this because he worked there during it. Jim Crockett Jr. was a super high grossing wrestling promoter. I mean, I believe in '86 he made something like 20-something million dollars. And he had the Great American Bash Tour, and you had various other things. And even with some of the stadium shows that didn't draw all that well, you see the hot crowds. The crowds were absolutely incredible, absolutely electric. They were ready to tear walls down if their favorite didn't win. They were ready to, erect statues if their favorite did win and beat the dastardly heel. And you think about Ric Flair pretty much got his big run starting in the Mid-Atlantic area. I mean, yes, he'd worked other places, but then he had that plane crash and stuff like that, and he was the guy in Jim Crockett Promotions. The NWA World Champion, he was a U.S. Champion for a bit. He did so much great stuff. Ric Flair and Jim Crockett Jr. were like, it was like Vince and Hogan, or, I mean, I wanted to say Vince and Warrior, but no, Vince and Hogan would be more accurate because, as went one, went the other. And Jim Crockett Jr. knew how to take care of Ric Flair, and Ric Flair being the NWA champion, being the, championing the, NWA title as the prestigious title. Jim Crockett Jr. Deserves a lot of credit for how he featured Flair. He would put him out to various territories, Florida. He'd have him go work in Dallas. Have him go work in a whole bunch of places to establish him as the new NWA champion. Yes, you had the NWA board of directors they had to do the vote at the time, even when the NWA was falling on its ass in territories. Kansas City, St. Louis. St. Louis is actually just a one-town promotion, but World Class getting away from the NWA and various others doing their own thing, still the NWA champion to me meant more than the WWE champion. That's no disrespect to anybody that held the WWE champion, or championship that is, but the NWA title meant so much, and Jim Crockett Jr. having that championship on his show gave it instant credibility. And then there was the tag teams. You know, you think about the Blackjacks. There were so many others. I mean, you think about even Jimmy Snuka and Paul Orndorff as a tag team. I mean, there were so many great tag teams. It would take forever to go through all of them. And then you get the Rock and Roll Express, the Midnight Express. And you have the Young Bloods and the Briscoes at Starrcade 83. Jim Crockett was the grandfather of, you know, big events like that. The first big closed circuit event as far as, like, you know, big revenue and stuff like that. Starrcade 83, Flair for the Gold. And it was incredible. Now, yes, you can look back on that and say, oh, okay, well, some of these things didn't age all that well, but you're going to get that with a show that's nearly 40 years old. Jim Crockett Jr. and Dusty, because Dusty Rhodes would come in, they were doing, you know, some great business because Dusty had some really good ideas and he had Jim Crockett Jr., the money man. Jim Crockett Jr. knew how big Dusty was, how great his ideas were, and they were also in lockstep. And they worked hard to take the promotion to new heights. And all through that, Jim Crockett Jr. put the right people in charge. He did everything he could to make wrestling mean as much as possible in the Carolinas and Virginias. And I mean, you can see they would have been just fine being in those areas and maybe even being in Florida and stuff like that because it was still Eddie Graham type wrestling when Eddie Graham unfortunately had his untimely suicide. Not that there's ever a timely one, but he, you know, through a lot of reasons ended up taking his own life, which is very unfortunate. And Florida, what happened is we got a lot of territories that went under the Jim Crockett Promotions banner, you know, Kansas City, Florida, and then the Atlanta office was taken away and Georgia Championship Wrestling went by the wayside. Even though they did shows in the Omni and drew pretty damn well, there, you know, it was all these territories and all this expansion and everything that ultimately was kind of part of the reason of what did them in and some other deals and stuff like that. And Vince McMahon, of course, blocking Jim Crockett on pay-per-view, and I'm not going to get too angry about that, but he did. And the cable companies weren't very smart because they thought, well, wait a second, if he says that if we carry this pay-per-view, that he won't carry WrestleMania, and he needs his pay-per-view revenue, why don't we just say no, because he'd be shooting himself in the foot, and he would have been. And at that point, you know, you had Starrcade 83, it was closed circuit. You had 84, which was a little dodgy, but, you know, 84 was a bit of a rough year because Dusty was putting his team in place and doing some stuff, but still, they had great talent. And then you had Dusty and Flair, the iconic rivalry that they had. You had the formation of the Four Horsemen in, you know, the TBS studios. I mean, or I don't remember the name of the studios right off the bat. I do apologize for that. But so many people got their start there or got their big national exposure there. The Russians, Ivan Koloff, Nikita Koloff, Crusher Khrushchev, who Barry Darsow, Demolition Smash, and Hole in One Barry Darsow. Yeah, I never understood that gimmick either. But you think about the promos in particular, like, you know, that classic set and everything where they would do the promos and they would just be able to fire this stuff off. You know, Tony Schiavone being the guy that did, you know, the interviews in the mid to late 80s, and that's where he really got his big break. And then you got, of course, David Crockett saying stuff like, whip him like a dog. And God, I can only imagine how David feels. It's really terrible. Really, really terrible. Like, as far losing a family member, just losing somebody that close to you, family or otherwise, it's just absolutely tough. But, you know, Jim Crockett Jr. kept doing great things. Like him and Dusty, you know, formed the idea of the Great American Bash 1985, which was a big deal at Charlotte Memorial Stadium. So they already had Starrcade 83, Starrcade 84. They had Great American Bash 1985. They were doing big houses. They were doing tremendous business. Carolinas, Virginias. They were doing good in Chicago. They were doing good in Florida. They were doing good in a lot of places. And then, unfortunately, they were just going in places they shouldn't have. And you just look at it, I just still wish this wrestling was still around. I'm not throwing around a blame game. I'm not going to throw that here. That's not what this show is about. I just wish that this style of wrestling was still around. And to an extent, with the NWA studio show that they've been doing, you know, that has been unfortunately on ice for a little bit due to the pandemic, that presented the type of wrestling that I enjoyed, and it gave me a nostalgia feel of, oh, this is the type of stuff where Jim Crockett Jr. would have wanted to see his vision taken, into the future. And just looking at what this entire promotion was able to do, the people they were able to feature, it's just really sad. It's really, really sad that it ended the way it did. It went to World Class Championship Wrestling, or not World Class, but it became WCW under Ted Turner, and they would co-promote with other promotions before that. They would do great business. We got the Super Clash and stuff like that, which didn't work out all that well, and then Jim Crockett realized he could do his own business. But yeah, the merger, getting Mid-South, UWF, and doing some good things with the talent, but just a lot of things where it's like, I really, really just wish that this company, this brand of wrestling was still around at the height that it was. Now, it probably wouldn't have been. Everything does eventually have to change as far as companies, but it would have been really interesting to see what could have happened if Jim Crockett Promotions had carried on. But his influence from just the local TV studio shows, take a look at how those promos are presented. He would feature talents the right way. He would make sure to put Dusty and other bookers and just let people be who they were. And he was the figurehead. He was the guy. And he is a big reason why that company got to the big heights that it did. Because yes, you can have a great booker. Without a great person in charge, like Jim Crockett Jr., it wouldn't have done as well. And yes, you can go to Black Saturday and stuff like that when they got kicked off of TBS because Vince McMahon was playing dirty, and then got $1 million from Crockett Promotions to fund WrestleMania. And then we were off to the races there. But Jim Crockett Jr., the Great American Bash tours. Yes, by '88 it got ridiculous as far as yes, they were drawing great money and everything, but '86, they had some great stadium shows, and they also had some tight shows. They were in smaller venues, but still could seat 5,000 people, and they were doing incredible houses. They were doing a great amount of money. They were paying people like crazy. The Road Warriors were a great team there. And then, the Steiner Brothers were only around in WCW, but like I said, the Youngbloods, the Briscoes, Flair, Dusty, Magnum TA, and Tully Blanchard. Haven't even gotten a chance to mention that. That was a great feud, and that all happened with Jim Crockett Jr., making sure that people were featured the right way. And the '86 Great American Bash was great. '87, there were some, things here and there, and there were some issues and stuff like that, as you're going to get with a live event tour like that. But they were doing great business and as close to what Vince McMahon could do, and it's just a real shame this wrestling company could not stick around longer. And really, I don't have a ton else to say there because Jim Crockett Jr. just really was so influential. The amount of realism that came across the screen. You believed something that Tully Blanchard would say, or any of the Four Horsemen would say. You believed anything J.J. Dillon would say. J.J. Dillon was just recently on an episode of AEW Dynamite, and him and Arn and Tully on the same show the night that Jim Crockett Jr. passed away. I think that would be a very fitting tribute, even though I don't believe the news broke until during the show, and it just was absolutely heartbreaking in general. I didn't actually see the news until a few hours after it happened. It's just really sad. Jim Crockett Jr. is a big reason why I'm a wrestling fan and why I will always be a wrestling fan, because it reminds me the Jim Crockett influence. Reminds me of how wrestling can be presented in an entertaining way, but also in a realistic way, sports-based, and just blood feuds and stuff like that. Even feuds that didn't involve blood, it just felt real. It had realism to it. It just felt so real. And he's a big reason why I'm a wrestling fan, and I will always appreciate what he did and what he promoted, and how much passion and heart and everything that he put into his father's business, taking it to heights that I don't think the family ever thought they would go to. And it's great that they did, because a lot of wrestling fans benefited from seeing some great goddamn wrestling, some great feuds, and some great, shows just in general. Like, Jim Crockett Jr. will be sorely missed. Share your thoughts in the comments. Share your memories of Jim Crockett Promotions, like Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, whatever. Post some matches in the comments if there are particular ones you think the fans should check out. Do your own videos. Let's keep the memory of Jim Crockett Jr. alive. And rest in peace, Jim Crockett Jr. You will be sorely missed. You won't be forgotten. You will be sorely missed. And your influence will continue to live on.